Have you ever thought about the real life implications of God as our creator, as the designer? Often we only ever hear about the idea of God as creator in the creation account, and arguments against things like evolution, and really the argument of origins is where you hear about it the most. But the real life implications of Genesis go far beyond just the point of origin and come down to the very grit of our everyday life. In the philosophy that I like to call the God of systems, or seeing God as the God of systems. That is what we want to talk about today on the second ever episode of For Real Life and Godliness Podcast, the podcast that takes the Word of God and puts it down into the grit of your real life. I'm your host, as always, Pastor Will, and we'll be right back after this. As I said, my personal philosophy, I like to call the God of systems. I'm sure there are other names for it. Maybe there's a doctrine for it. I don't really know. I know what I've understood throughout my real life, and that's what I'm going to bring to you today. And that's what I bring every time we have a podcast. I'm just going to bring my personal point of view along with the scripture and how I have seen it work out in my life practically. I'm not going to be necessarily always reading from some kind of theological, doctrinal kind of book, unless I feel like it's necessary to get the real essence of what I'm trying to discuss. Last week, we talked about A.W. Tozer's book, The Pursuit of God, and that is not a book of doctrine. It is a book of experience, and really his format, his template, I guess, for how he explained the pursuit of God, especially chapter 10, which was very impactful in my life, and as the responses have been so far, very impactful in yours. That's the kind of style I want to go with, where I'm speaking from experience as much as possible. And we'll delve into things doctrinally as necessary. But doctrine are rules that we, like the skeleton. Doctrine is the skeleton of what we believe on our faith. The muscles are how we actually practice those things. And we know from the Bible that the doctrine of love, I guess, well, by itself would be the heart of everything we do. So that's kind of how that works. Anyways, in the Bible, it does say, 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33, that God is not the author of confusion, but of peace. And it goes on and says, as in all churches of the saints. James says, where envying and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. Even in the Old Testament, when it's outlining the moral boundaries of God's people, it refers to the idea of confusion and those things, and how those are being warned against, those are being punished, those are being restricted or completely removed from that society due to the confusion that it brings, because it is outside of the natural boundaries of God's natural system. And this goes into a lot of different things in life, not just creation, not just morality, but also in how you live your everyday life. He is not the author of confusion. We understand that Satan, in what he did in the beginning, introduced confusion into the world as we know it, and that confusion is sin. It is our impulse to do things against the system of God. Essentially, that is what sin is. It is an impulse against the system that God has set up. When Adam and Eve were tempted in the garden, God had given them a system to live by. He was God. He was their father, their creator. He had an intimate relationship with them. He was there with them. He gave them work to do. He gave them responsibilities to take care of. He gave them their relationship with each other. And he only really gave them one restriction, which was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we understand that that tree was not magical. It is in the act of taking the fruit that it was forbidden that they gained the knowledge of how to do wrong, how to assess the wrong thing to do, how to think about it, how to premeditate an action that was against the rules that God had put down for us. Now, many people don't like the idea of rules, but rules are how everything works. The way I tell it to my students often is that when we play sports, There has to be rules. There has to be boundaries. There has to be goals. There has to be marks and hash marks on the field, or half court on the basketball court, or the lines on a baseball diamond where they're running from place to place. You have to know what to do. You have to play within those rules. Now, people like to bend them, like to push them, but without rules, without boundaries, games, competitions don't exist. They just don't. If I were, and I gave them this example a few weeks ago, as I taught my seventh and eighth grade Sunday school class, I told them if I were to bring in here a football helmet and a basketball and a baseball bat and just a bunch of random sports equipment from all over the place, a lacrosse net and a soccer ball or a football, however you want to say that. And I were to bring them in and just hand them all to you and say, go ahead, kids, go play the game. You would probably ask, which game? Which one are we playing? And I said, just the game. And well, where are we going to play this? If we're going to play football, we need a football field. If we're going to play basketball, we need a basketball goal. If we're going to play baseball, we need bases. And if I were to say, no, you don't need any of those things, just go out there and play, no one's going to do that, because you can't do that. You have to have rules. You have to have boundaries. There must be a system that determines how the game is played, how the game is won and lost, and how different things happen within the game as it progresses. That's how games are played. And it's a system that everybody voluntarily goes into so that they can play the game. Without it, you are not able to win, because there is no goal. There is no point. There's no way to get points. There's no way to compete when there is not a finish line, or even a start line, or even a course. If you're running a race, you must have three things. You have to have at least a start point, a finish point, and whatever's in between that, the course itself. It could be straight. It could be an oval. It could be cross country. But there must be a course set out. There must be a system by which the race is played. And the same thing goes for science. There are laws that we discover as we go. They were not written by a man. They're simply discovered by a man. And so when we go through the things of science, there are rules. There's laws like, of thermodynamics, where everything breaks down. It reduces itself and becomes less, not more. It doesn't evolve upward. It goes downward, which is one of the biggest, I feel, arguments against the idea of upward evolution. But we're not really talking about origin or even the process today. We're simply talking about the idea of systems. So science has its systems, it has its bearings, it has its, or it's really the pursuit of what boundaries we have in this world. That's kind of what I see science to be. So we understand that there is gravity, we understand there's magnetism, and there's electricity, and the different laws that govern those things, even light. And as we go forward in process and in progress in this world, we find out more about those behaviors. But for the most part, those behaviors act according to a certain system, even if we don't understand what those systems are yet. Time, for example, we are starting to understand more about. That is not a solid kind of concept. It's not a social construct. Time actually passes. Time can pass slower. It can pass faster depending on where you are. Gravity affects time. The farther away you are from gravity, the less, I believe, time's effect has on you, if I'm proper about that. I am not in any way a scientist or a physicist or any of those kind of things, but I do know that these things are developing before us. The idea of the systems that govern the things around us, even time. We understand a lot about matter, and we're learning things about space, and we're learning things about time, how they interact with each other, and how the forces within our solar system, our nature, this universe that God has given us to live in, how those things affect each other. They affect each other with systems. Now, the simplest way to put this, as far as a physical example of systems that we live in and rely on every day, and remember what we're talking about, the God of systems, the fact that he is not the author of confusion, but rather the God of order, that he's put things in certain order, certain categories, with certain relationships that must happen. They cannot not happen. If they don't happen, then we're kind of stuck. And one of the easiest ways to go about looking at this is the system that exists between man, really any living animal, and the plants and anything that produces oxygen. As we breathe out what they breathe in what they breathe out. And that cycle, I probably should look up the actual term for that cycle. I've forgotten the name of it, back in elementary school whenever I learned about it. But the reality is the system exists. It has to exist the way it does. And if it did not, we would die and they would die. One cannot live without the other. Animal life, human life must exist alongside that of plant life, with trees and grass and moss and I guess seaweed and pretty much anything that's green and that grows. Anything that is not animal life, human life, is contributing to our life, though. And so we live in that cycle. We live in the cycle of that system, and it must exist the way that it exists. Otherwise, we don't exist, so we don't continue on. So as we understand that God is the God of systems, that He created a universe that runs on systems, the implications of that go into your real life, your everyday life. Morally speaking, there are certain systems God set up that are moral. There are societal implications for how God set up the system of human beings. There was a man created. He was perfect in his creation, yet God saw lack in his life, which means that He created man with a lack that cannot be completed by himself. And so He creates woman, and together they have a complete unit as God designed it to be, each one having strengths and weaknesses that are complemented and helped by the other. And so as much as Eve was created to be the helper of Adam, Adam also fulfills the needs of his wife Eve, or man and woman. And so those things from the beginning were the system that God set up. Even Jesus refers to this. He tells His disciples and those listening that divorce was not meant to be a thing from the beginning, but a man was to leave his family behind and take his wife forever, which is the implication there, because that was the system that God has set up. It was not meant for children to grow up in single parent houses. We see the result of that today. The houses that have single parents in them, as much as they strive and do all they possibly can to make their child's or children's life good, they are missing something, regardless of whether it's single mother, or a single father. The fact that they're missing those things affects the child. And we understand that just from societal implications today. And so that's there. The moral implications of that as well is that man was created to take one wife forever. And, people always point to the Old Testament. What about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all these other guys? And we understand that those things in that time were as wrong as they are today. However, we know from Acts, 17:30, that there were times of ignorance in the Old Testament that God overlooked, but now He commands all people everywhere to repent. And so there were parts of the system, once Adam and Eve sinned and went against God's original intent, that fell apart. And one of those things was marriage, for sure. And we watch, even in Jacob's life, who would become named Israel later, how the relationships between his wives, having multiple wives, was not a good thing. Abraham's life, you can see multiple wives was not a good thing. And David's life, same thing. Solomon's life, same thing. There's even an old preacher I saw a story about the other day, I think from the early 1900s or late 1800s, who said, if Solomon had, have many wives he had, then I can have at least two. And yet, if you look at the lives of the people who had multiple wives at one time, their lives are not lives you want to emulate. You just don't. And so the principles were still there. The truth was still there. But because the revelation of the truth of God, i.e. the Bible itself, was not completely open to those people, it says God overlooked those things in those times of ignorance. So just because the Old Testament has things in it that don't fit with the truth of what we understand in the New Testament today does not mean that those things are how we should live. It's just not. Those are times that went by. God in the New Testament has corrected all the things that were in the Old Testament. There are plenty of people in there who live by faith, but they did not live all of them in the truth. They did not all live the moral lives that we think about today when we talk about morality and truth. God corrected those things in the New Testament through the ministry of Jesus Christ and his apostles. And so the system was brought back into order when the New Testament is revealed. So that is the importance of the New Testament and reading it in that light. Because God's system from the beginning was this way. And just because you've seen people that God used in the Old Testament did it a different way does not mean that God was cool with that. What it means, though, is that those people were ignorant of the truth, and God was more concerned about bringing his son into the world over time than he was about trying to correct this guy and that guy and that guy from the things that they were doing in their culture, because it was a cultural thing. But now that the truth is completely revealed, his system is being returned to what it should have been in the first place. So I don't know why I got off on that tangent. Like I said, some of this is brain dump. Some of this is just me, how I see things connecting in my life and how I teach. But that is a picture of how the God of systems is bringing things back into order. And the New Testament really is correcting a lot of misgivings that the Old Testament had, because they did not have the full revelation of the truth. And that was one of them. Marriage was one of them. And so those things, when it comes to marriage, that system is pretty much set. So the implications of this in other places in your life, there are certain things that happen in the natural world that also happen in our lives. One of the big things that Jesus brings up in the New Testament is sowing and reaping, about how you don't get something if you don't put something in. The idea of cost, and this is going to be probably a whole different podcast by itself, but the idea of investment, of sowing, of planting, of performing the hard tasks first before you get to see the good that will come down the road, that idea is throughout nature and the Bible. And so it is a system. It is a system that you cannot get around. Take the idea of wealth building, for instance. Wealth building is a system. It is a system just like nature has systems. The idea of sowing and reaping, the fact that you must put in to get out. If you want wealth, you must put in work, you must put in time, you must put in investments. Those things have to happen. When you have investments, you have the time that you put them in, the time they must grow, and then the time to reap. And that time is extended for, at different times, just like all kinds of different plants, they grow at different rates. Corn grows up like this, in the year it's planted, and it shoots up. You could put a camera on it and just watch the thing grow, over a few weeks. But bamboo grows down for 5 years before it grows up. So some people's investments come up quick, but are gone quick. Some grow over time, and they're usually, sustained growth is always, or usually better growth. But regardless, there must be a planting, there must be a growing, there must be a reaping, right? And so that's a part of a system we see in our lives. And Jim Rohn says this, and this is kind of one of the things that solidified the idea of systems in my head, was that just like the seasons pass in nature, again, the systems of nature, we see this also in our lives. And he said there'll be spring seasons in your life, there'll be summer seasons, there'll be fall seasons, there'll be winter seasons. There are times when you have to plant. There are times you have to watch what you have planted to make sure you don't lose the crop you've planted. There will be times you get to reap the benefits of what you've done. And then there are times of winter when you are tested, right? He didn't say all of that. He said that basically his idea was that things come into our life with regularity, just like day and night and seasons pass. And his whole thing was that when you have good times, you have to be preparing in the good times for bad times. And from that, I just extrapolated my own personal philosophy of this. And that is that you go through times, and I look back over my life for the last decade or so, went from the times I was in Florida to the times I moved here and to what I look forward in the future. And I could see in about 2 year increments, those periods of time that coincided with spring, summer, fall, and winter. And as I said, spring was talking about system here. The spring is a time to plant. It's a time of your life when you are putting things in and you want them to grow, but you have to put in the investment. Then there are other times you're going to be watching over the things that you've planted to make sure you don't lose those crops and those investments that you've made. And then there's a time of reaping when you begin to enjoy the things that you've planted, the seasons you've been through, and all of this stuff happens. And it might be a promotion, it might be a new job, or you started a company that's finally taking off. For instance, after the time you've planted, say, your investment seeds, and you've worked super hard over the summer to make sure that seed grows right, and your company is coming to fruition, or your ministry, or whatever it might be, and then you begin to reap, and good things are happening. But Jim Rohn's point in his thing was that you have to watch after that happens, that the winter's coming. And so winter is not a bad thing, but it is a testing time. And so all the things you've planted, Proverbs says, like the ant who prepares her meat in summer, need to be being kept and invested wisely when you reap the harvest. It can't just be just eat it all. When you begin to go through a really good spot and things are taking off and you're making money, you're making impact, and you're going, your plan is working, you must be aware that there's going to be a point soon where winter sets in and you're going to be tested in that. And winter is a time of revealing. It strips the plant, the leaves from the trees. It causes some animals to go and hide. It brings other animals out, the ones who are stronger, who can handle it. And different things happen in winter. And it's all about testing. And if you are the foolish son who spends everything he has, as Proverbs says, you'll have nothing when winter comes, and you'll be begging for food when winter comes. But the wise son prepares in summer, the ant prepares in summer, and over again, we see how Proverbs, how people we understand today as investors, how my philosophy is going, is all based upon systems that happen that we can see in nature, we can see in ourselves, we can see in life, and they come with regularity, they come in waves, and you can live a life of success when you know that when things are good, there will be times when things are bad. And that may seem pessimistic, but the reality is that when you live with the idea of a system happening, you can prepare when things are good so that when times are bad, you can take advantage. For example, 2008, 2009, the housing market crashed, right? Everybody kind of knows that already, at least in the US. I don't really know the implications ahead around the world. But it crashed. Anyone who had capital and had money saved back in that period of time and had money set aside to buy, they prospered because everything went downhill. They couldn't, most normal people who were not thinking ahead, who thought that the boom at the time would just keep going, where people are building houses all over the place. And there are developments that you could drive through a couple years ago from 2008 period that were just bare landscape. They had cleared the land. They even had plumbing in the ground, and some of them even had foundations laid down. I remember in Florida, I used to drive by this one place, and I think it was supposed to be apartments or condos, and it was just a big shell of concrete. They got that far, but 2008 hit and boom, they were gone. Everything was built on credit. People lost a lot of stuff, but the people who had prepared and had not just loaned themselves out to to have really overstretched themselves, and they were prepared, they are the ones who are succeeding today because they prepared themselves in the time of summer for the times of winter. And now we were in the time of summer, and now we're kind of ending, we're going into a kind of worse economy now. But if you look back in economics, you look back in time, you see times where we go up, times we go down. You look in your own life, there are times that you're up, there are times you were down. If you look in nature, you have times that things are great, things are warm, things are growing, things are being harvested, and then there's times where everything dies and testing comes. This is how systems and knowing that God is a God of systems impacts your life. When you begin to look at how God has ordered the world and you stop trying to live outside of that order and you start to actually live within it, you begin to have success in places you have tried to have success over your life. Maybe even in your marriage, you have to sow and reap in your marriage. There are times where things are great, there are times when things are not so great. There are times of testing, hard times come, different things happen, things are said. And if you're not building strong relationships, even during the times where everything's great, when times get hard and things hit your family, say economically or even relationally, and you haven't built up systems in your life where you can deal with that, and you haven't prepared, you haven't been praying, you haven't been in the word, you haven't been in church, you're going to fall apart. And you have to know that no marriage, no company, no ministry, no business, no life ever just goes up and up and up. If you ever look at investments, if you look over time, you see it going like this, right? It's like this kind of diagonal upward. But if you zoom into just even individual years, you'll see it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. Sometimes it goes way down and then it shoots way up, but it's never consistent over its shorter periods of time, but over time, it's obviously going up. And within those times when things go down, whether it's in life, in the stock market, in the economy, in your business, in your marriage, in your ministry, in your life, your job, whatever it might be, your health, you're going to have those kind of things. And that is probably a whole lot more than I should have said, because you might see those as being really disjointed and not all over the place. But I think you can see the breadth of what I'm talking about when I talk about the philosophy of God as being the author of systems and not of confusion. That your life operates on a system, on seasons, on days going by, and there are good days, there are bad days, and preparing for bad days when you're in good days is important, because bad days will come. Just like winter comes, just like night comes after day, and then day after night. You know that when you're daytime, you work while it's day, night's coming, but there's also going to be a morning, right? And so that also gives you hope when if you're in a bad time right now, that there's going to be a better day. Each one of these things, as you learn them, and as you see, and I think as you look in and analyze your own life, you will see these systems working out even in your own personal life. And as I said, this is really more my personal philosophy and how I've seen God's word applied to my own life through different people and their philosophies and what they said, and just sitting down and really considering. And really the capstone to this in the Bible, beside him just not being author of confusion, is Job 12:7-10, where it talks about, it says, speak to the beasts, they shall teach you, to the birds, speak to the earth, it will teach you, let the fish of the sea inform you. And in all these cases, it means that if you look into God's natural systems around us, they will give you insight in how your own personal real life is also governed by systems, and you cannot get around them. You cannot get around them. And so hopefully that it made sense to you today. Hopefully that helps you. That is a huge piece of where I come from. That gives me a lot of peace, because I know when times are tough, that one, I know who's responsible. It's probably me, because I didn't prepare in summer. And that's something I've learned recently. And I have actually seen my life come through some winters that I went through in a bad way, because I did not prepare in times when things were good. And I'm seeing myself now come in out of I would say, a period of spring in the summer right now. And I'm more aware of my life and the implications of my everyday conduct and investments now than I have ever been in my life. Because now that I've looked back and I've considered my life, and I see with regularity that there are times of good, times of bad. I've seen the times of bad and how bad it was because I did not prepare in times when things were a whole lot easier. And I probably should have saved this for another podcast, because there's a good story that goes along with this, which we're way out of time at this point. But now, as I'm coming through my life, I'm coming into a time of summer, according to my own estimations. And I am trying to make sure I do not lose the things that I have sowed over the last 2.5 to 3 years. And not forgetting the lessons I learned in the winter time of, 2019 into 2020, and seeing what happened to me there that could have been prevented had I learned these lessons a lot sooner. So hopefully that helps. Maybe we'll do another podcast on this more specifically on the seasons of life and how I see them. If that's something that interests you, put it in the comment below, and we'll look at that. But yeah, so that is our podcast for today. Again, I'm Pastor Will, your host, and this has been the For Real Life and Godliness Podcast. We will see you or hear you, speak to you. I'm not sure how to sign off. I'm just signing off. See ya.